Hi, it's Seta here. In this video, I will show you a complete and highly detailed guide to Unity HDRP Water System. We will go through every single options and settings, not just the water component itself, but also water decals, deformer, mask, and shaders. This tutorial will save you hours of searching through scattered piece of information because I've gathered everything in one place. So, if you really want to understand how the HDRP water system works, keep watching. In this video I will be using Unity 6, but most of the settings shown here are also available in the other engine version. First, let's add water system. So, to add it to the scene, go to Edit, Project Settings, and first in the Graphic tab, find Frame Settings, Camera, Rendering, and check if water is enabled. Then go to Quality, HDRP, Water, and enable the water system. Here we can also set the resolution of our simulation. The higher it is, the more detailed the water, but at the cost of performance. Below we mark whether our water will support decals, how many of them, and their atlas size. Here we can also specify whether water should support Excluder, which allows us, for example, to remove water from the inside of a boat. And below you can select that interaction script should run on GPU on CPU. If you don't know what to choose, then in your project water is entirely a visual effect with a small amount of script interaction, choose GPU. If manuscript will interact with water, choose CPU. And now let's go back to our scene. At this point, it's also worth adding water rendering to our global volume. To do this, go to your global volume or create a new one, and then choose Add Override, Lighting, Water Rendering, select All, and set the state to Enable. We will come back to the other options later. Now we can finally add our water to the scene. To do this, right-click in the hierarchy window, then go to Water, Surface, Ocean, Sea or Lake. Click on your ocean and raise it up a bit to adjust it to the terrain. If you now look at the inspector window, we have several tabs here. Let's start with General tab. First, we have the surface type, where you can choose whether we want oceans, river or pool. Each of these has its own settings, but I will choose ocean because it includes all the settings. Next, we have geometry type. If we choose quad, we can manually adjust the size of the water in our scene by increasing or decreasing the scale. It is used when you need simple water that impact performance the least, because the number of vertices stay at the same regardless of size. You can see this by switching to wireframe and scaling the object. The triangle stretches or shrink based on size. Another option is custom, where we can add a mesh and generate the shape of the water based on it. This is especially useful when creating irregular lakes or rivers. For this, we can use Pro Builder, available in the package manager. After installing it, choose Tools, Pro Builder, Editors, create Polyshape, and then create any shape by clicking on the scene. When you finish, disable Mesh Renderer, so the object is not visible in the scene, and also Mesh Collider if you don't want the player to walk on the water. Then go to the ocean, and in the Mesh Renderer tab, add your object. As you can see, the water takes the shape of your model. Of course, you can go back and edit it to better fit the terrain, or export it as a separate mesh, using Tools, Pro Builder, Export. Just remember that this object must stay in the scene, even if disabled, because the water uses it to get all position data. The next option in geometry type is instanced quads. At the first glance, it looks no different from regular quads. But when we switch to wireframe view, we will see it looks completely different, because here, vertex density is scaled based on the distance from the camera. The closer, the more vertices or wave we have, making water less angular. If we now go back to water rendering in the global volume, we can control triangle's density using the triangle size slider. The last option in geometry type is infinity, which is almost the same as instanced quads, but in this case, water is rendered all the way to the horizon, regardless of camera position. Next, in our options, we have the time multiplier, which controls the speed of the water simulation. This might be a little confusing because it doesn't only speed up water animation, it speeds up or slows down the entire simulation. So if you have shoreline waves or drifting object, there will be speed up or slow down too. The speed of the water animation itself is controlled by current speed in the simulation tab, but we will get there later. Next we have script interaction. So if we want to use any script, such as a drifting object, this option must be enabled. Below, we can decide whether we want not just the main waves, but also small ripples to be considered in the scripts, which of course comes at the cost of extra CPU calculation and may affect performance. The final element is tessellation, which allows us to artificially add more geometry to the model and smooth out the edges. The easiest way to explain this is change geometry type to custom and change view to wireframe. As you can see, the mesh we created has only a few triangles, so the water simulation will be quite blocky. But we can artificially increase the number of triangles using tessellation. With the slider, we can set how many triangles we want to add to make our water smoother. With tessellation factor fade start, we can set the distance at which those extra triangles start disappearing to avoid overloading the system. And with tessellation factor fade range, we can set how far from the start point of extra triangles should completely vanish. Before we get into the simulation tab, quick reminder: if you don't see some of the settings I'm showing, click on the three dots in the top corner of the component and make sure Show Advanced Property is enabled. Now, to understand the simulation tab, we need to know how waves are actually formed in Unity Water System. They are generated based on different frequencies, which we call bands. They are responsible for the size, speed, and behavior of waves. For simplicity, let's call them low, medium, and high frequency bands. Let's start with the low frequency band, called the first band in the simulation tab. This frequency is responsible for generating the largest wave, and those are formed by distant wind and represent large, wide, and relatively slow-moving waves like those on the ocean. Next, we have medium frequency wave, called second band. These are smaller waves typically seen on lake during strong wind condition. If you are working on a river surface type, this second band is labeled agitation, but it's exactly the same type of waves caused by wind. Finally, we have high frequency bands, which create small ripples on the water surface. Those ripples can be generated by even light wind or water movement. I mention all of this because in the simulation tab there is a settings called water mask, where you can add a custom texture to control how those waves bands behave across your water surface. For example, if you want to simulate a stormy sea but have calmer waves inside a bay, You can create a texture that loads the wave strength in specific areas. If you want to create this texture, you must use a graphic editor. I used Photoshop, but you can create this in any program. So first let's create a new image, then go into the channels, and you will see 3 channels there. Each of them is responsible for something different. The red channel controls large waves, first band, the green channel controls medium waves, second band, and blue channel controls ripples. The closer the color in a given channel is to black, the more that band will be muted. As example, let's create a texture with a black line in the red channel and save it as a PNG. After importing it into Unity, click on it and set the wrap mode to clamp and click apply. Now click on your ocean and add it to the water mask slot. Now go to the Mask tab and in debug mode, set the water mask view and select the channel you want to preview. Use the extend and offset settings to adjust its size and position. After setting everything, turn off debug mode, and now if we increase the distance with speed, we can see that our first band rises only where there was no black color in the texture. Using remapping, we can also control the influence of the water mask on our water. Of course, I encourage you to take a moment and test those textures yourself, because they can be useful. And now we move on to the specific settings of our water. If we zoom out the camera, we can see that our waves repeat from time to time, like texture on terrain. By increasing or decreasing the repetition size, we can control the scale of our water. This can be useful if we want to adjust wave size to our terrain, because we must remember that the bigger the value, the less repetition we will see, but we can get higher waves. Next, we have distant wind speed, where we control the speed of distant wind and therefore the size of our large and medium waves, which is the first band and second band, or agitation if you are creating a river. Using chaos, we can control whether the water moves in the random direction on its surface or only in the direction of the wind. Next, we have orientation, where we can set in degrees the direction the wind should blow and therefore the direction the waves should move. Below, we can set how fast our water will move, and that takes into account first band, second band and ripples. And as I mentioned before, this parameter only speed ups or slow down the water speed, while the time multiplier acts like a global acceleration to the entire simulation. Here we have a place for the current map. Thanks to it, we can locally control the direction in which our water flows. This is especially useful when we have, for example, an irregular river. To create such a texture, we unfortunately have to use external software such as Krita, which is a free image editor. After installing and opening Krita, click on the new file, then choose Custom Document and set the resolution. Click on Content and change the background color to black, because black color will not affect the water in place where we don't paint anything in the texture. After setting everything, click Create. Now we need to create a special brush that depends on the direction we'll use different colors. To do this, click on the icon next to the brush or press F5. In the next window, click on the arrow and in the list choose Tangent Normal. Click on the brush icon and in General tab, check Tangent Tilt. Next, in the Tangent Encoding window, set red to -x, green to -y, and blue to -z. In the Tilt option window, check Direction and save the new brush. Now, if you start painting with this brush, you will see that depending on the direction, it will change its color. That will be the direction in our water in specific place. The red and green channel are responsible for swell air ripples, and the blue channel for the power of this texture influence in a specific place on the water. Now, save the texture as PNG and add it to Unity. Then in Unity, click on the texture and change it to wrap mode to clamp. Now click on the ocean and add the texture to the current map. If we now go back to the debug mode and choose current, we will see arrows showing the direction in which water flows. As before, we can use extend or offset to adjust our texture. And using influence, you can set how much it affects our water. And again, I encourage you to spend some time creating such a texture, because they are very useful when creating rivers. Going further, we have first band, that is our big waves. With the help of amplitude dimmer, we can set the size of the waves. Of course, as I said before, the maximum size also depends on the value we have in repetition size and how strong the wind is that we set in distant wind speed. Here we have the exact height of our waves will reach at maximum. Below we have the fade option, and if we click on it, then with the settings none, waves are generated across the entire surface. The automatic option automatically determines whether the waves should already fade. Where we choosing custom, we can specify at what distance from the camera the waves should start fading. Second band, or agitation in the case of river, work in exactly the same way and has exactly the same functions. And now we have ripples, that is the smallest wave. Using local wind speed, we can adjust the speed of the local wind or how high the ripples on the water will be as a result of its action. Below, we can set whether the water should flow in the direction of the wind or be more chaotic. The wind direction is now taken from our orientation in the swell settings, but we can change it if we choose custom. Then we can set the direction and speed only for the ripples. Below we have the current map again, but it works exactly the same way as previous one, except only for ripples. And the last option in this section is fade, which works exactly the same as in the case of swell. So I think it doesn't need to be discussed again. The next tab on our list is water decals, but we will get to this tab later when we talk about deformation, foam and everything else. For now, let's move on to the Appearance tab. The first option we have is Custom Material, where you can assign your own material for water. If you leave this empty, the water will use the default material. And if you click New, the new material based on the HDRP Water shader will be created. Double-clicking the created shader will open the shader graph, a graphic shader editor in Unity that allows you to create and modify the look of shader without writing code. Thanks to this, you can easily add to water an effect like foam around object. Shader graph is a very powerful tool that's definitely worth learning. It will come in handy not just for the water, but also for creating materials for characters, objects, special effects and more. But this isn't a shader graph tutorial, so let's move on to the next section, Smoothness. With the value range, you can control how smooth and shiny the water is, meaning how strongly it reflects lights. Lowering the smoothness range gives you more matte water with blurred reflections. It works great, for example, in rough sea, where the waves are more matte and scatter the light more. Increasing the range gives you the shiner water with clear reflections, like a calm lake on a windless day. But it's also important to understand why sometimes at the highest value the sun's reflections disappear. First, it all depends on the value set in the directional light under angular diameter. This is where you define the actual size of the sun, that is, how large the surface is from which the light rays are emitted. This affects, for example, the sharpness of shadowing edge and, in our case, the size of the sun's reflection on the water. When you set the smoothness value to 1, the surface behaves like a mirror that reflects light in exactly one direction. If that direction doesn't align with the camera, you won't see any glare. When you lower the smoothness, the light reflection begins to scatter, which means more of it reaches your camera. That's why you can see, for example, the reflection of sunrise on the water surface. It is worth adding that the smoothness parameter is not a single number, but a range of values. That is a minimum and maximum. That's because the water system doesn't treat the surface as complete uniform, but rather as something dynamic, which changes depending on the viewing angle, wave motion, or distance from the camera. Extending this range allows Unity to randomly change smoothness within the value range, which makes the water not look artificial and the reflection change dynamically, giving a more natural effect. Below we have fade range, which determines at what distance from the camera those values are supposed to be interpolated. Close to the camera, the water can be shiny and realistic, and farther away more matte and less demanding on rendering. Next we have Refraction, and it is a group of settings that controls how what is under the water looks when we look through its surface. That is, how light refracts, how deep we can see, and what color the water has from the outside. In the color section, we can set the color of the light passing through the water surface. It is exactly that colors that will be applied to the object located under the water when we look at them from above. To better illustrate this, imagine a green glass filled with water. If you shine a flashlight through the glass, the light after passing through will have a green color. The glass is our water surface, and the color of that glass is our color in the refraction section. The brighter the color, the more transparent the glass becomes. Of course, the color of water inside the glass also affects how the light looks, but I hope that now you better understand what this parameter does in Unity. The next parameter is maximum distance. It determines how deep below the water surface the effect of refraction or bending of lights will work. In simple terms, it controls how much the image underwater will bend and ripple when we look at the bottom. This happens because rays reflected off the bottom are refracted in the water before they reach our camera, which causes that everything we see underwater seems to move, be distorted on float. Exactly like in real life when we look through rippling water at rocks or sand on the bottom. Next we have the absorption distance parameter, which lets us determine how much light will be absorbed by the water. In practice, this means that we can set whether the water will be more transparent or murky. The smaller the value, the faster the light disappears in the depth and the water looks deeper. The larger the value, the farther the light travels, which makes the water brighter and more transparent. Next, we have the scattering section, which is responsible for watercolor settings and the way light scatters inside it. Color defines the color that water takes on the light scattering. The brighter the color, the more light will pass through the water, giving it a lighter look. With ambient term, we control how much ambient light affects the overall brightness of the water surface. A higher value makes the whole surface appear brighter with ambient light. It is also worth mentioning that in global volume, in water rendering section, there is a parameter called ambient probe dimmer, which allows us to control the intensity of the ambient probe influence on water lighting. For example, if you are working with an overcast scene and want to slightly brighten the ambient light on the water surface, we can increase the ambient probe dimmer value to achieve a lighter water appearance. Next, we have height term that allows us to control the intensity of light scattering depending on the height of the waves. The higher the value, the more the waves will be lit up as they reach higher crests. For example, when light passes through a tiny layer of water on a wave tips. On the other hand, displacement term is responsible for scattering based on the water surface displacement, that is not just vertically but also horizontally. Thanks to this, light can realistically bend and scatter depending on the shape and direction of the waters. At the end, it is worth mentioning that the height term and displacement term are responsible for general light scattering regardless of light direction from the sun. They mainly take into account local features of the wave, its height and displacement, and not direction of the lights from the sun. Meanwhile, with direct light tip term, we can control how strongly the light will be scattered at the top of the waves, taking into account the direction and position of the sun, which will make the wave crest brighter. Direct light body term controls the same scattering but in the middle of the wave. Then we have the maximum height override. These parameters allow us to manually set the maximum wave height that Unity should take into account when calculating various water effects. This is important when we use, for example, deformers, because Unity doesn't know the height of such a wave and might miscalculate scattering on it. The next section is caustic. That is a light effect that appears when the light passes through rippling waters and create bright patterns on the bottom or on object submerged in water. Whether you use it or not, it's up to you, but I will discuss the options we can control when we activate this effect. First, we have caustic resolution, which determines the resolution of our light effect on the bottom. In simulation band, we can define what should drive this effect, whether they should appear due to the ripples or large waves or small waves. With virtual plane distance, we define the distance from which our light effects are simulated. The higher the value, the sharper those lights on the bottom will be. The smaller the value, the more blurred they will appear. So, if you have, for example, murky water, then these blurs should be bigger than in the case of crystal clear water. Next, we have tilting factors, which let us set how dense the grid of those light is and, with intensity, how bright they are. Caustic plane blend distance determines the distance from the water surface at which those lights effect will be visible. This is useful when, for example, we have very shallow water and we don't want those lights effect to be visible under it, but instead appear gradually as depth increase. The next option, directional shadows, determines whether shadow should affect where caustic appears. If we check these options, the brightness of the light's effect will be dimmed if they are in shadows. Using directional shadow distance, we can define how visible they are in those shadows. The last option in the appearance section that we can enable is underwater. Thanks to it, when the camera goes under the water, Unity will generate proper effect for it. It is worth mentioning that if the camera can't physically go underwater, this option should be disabled, because underwater effects are still generated even when the camera is not physically under the surface, and this affects performance. With volume depth, we can set the depth of the water surface at which the underwater effect is generated, because we don't want the situation when the camera goes too deep and the effect stops being displayed. If we use deformers to raise the water level with volume height parameter, we can specify the height to which the underwater effect should be generated inside such deformers. Because in that case, Unity takes two parameters into account: whether the camera is below the water surface and whether it's within the range defined by volume depth and height. If not, the underwater effect won't be generated. Therefore, using volume height, we can define the height above the water level, where after crossing the water surface, underwater will be turned on. If our scene has multiple overlapping water systems with volume priority, we can define which of those systems should be used for generating the underwater effect. The higher the value in volume priority, the more important the underwater effect of this water system will be. Next, we have absorption distance multiplier, which is linked to absorption distance parameter from the refraction section, and allow us to increase or decrease the absorption of light rays by water where we are under the surface. In other words, it increase or decrease underwater visibility. The last option we can enable is screen space reflection, which allows us, when we are under the water, to see the object above the water surface properly deformed by refraction and waves. Remember that the underwater effect is really just volumetric fog, so most of the settings from the volumetric fog section in global volume will also affect the appearance of the underwater. So when we are underwater and we turn on Caustics, Unity will render rays of light shining through the water. The same applies to other settings that we can control in volumetric fog. Before we go to the Form tab, we need to make sure that we have the foam options checked in the Water's Decals tab. Otherwise, the foam won't show up. We will discuss this tab in details in a moment, but now let's move on to the Foam tab. The first option is Persistence Multiplier, which determines how long the foam stays in the water surface before disappearing. To help you understand this better, I have here a simple water decal that generates foam. If I set the value to 0, we have less foam, but also when the object is moved, that foam disappears faster. If we increase this value, visually we will have more foam because the foam generated area stays longer, and after moving the object, the foam will disappear much slower than in the case of a small value. Here we have the current influence, which is responsible for whether our foam should move with the direction of the water or be more static. The higher the value, the faster the foam movement animation. Next option is color, where, as you can guess, we can set the color of the foam. It is also worth mentioning that the darker the color, the more transparent the foam becomes. Below, we have the Smoothness option, which is responsible for whether the foam should reflect light rays, meaning whether it should be shinier or more matte. If we set texture tilting to 0, it will turn out that our foam is a few shifting spots on the water. But using texture tilting, we can add a special texture to the place where their spot appears, which will give them a more distinct shape. With texture tilting, we also control how often this texture repeats on the surface of the water. Next, we have the simulation foam amount parameter, which allows us to control the amount of foam generated on our water. If we set it to 0, then no foam will be generated. However, if we choose any other value, then additional options will appear below. One of them is the mask field, where we can add a specially prepared texture that will allow us to define exactly where on the water surface the foam can appear. To prepare such a texture, we need to open any graphic program like Photoshop or Krita, then create a new file and go to the red channel. The black color completely suppresses the foam effect in the given area, while the lighter color, the more foam will be generated in that place. Next, let's save our texture as a PNG and add it to Unity. Let's click on the texture and in wrap mode set it to clamp. Then hit apply. Now when we add the texture to the mask field and go to mask debug mode and choose foam, we will get a preview of this texture on our water. Of course, using extend and offset we can control its size and position. The next settings is wind speed dimmer, where we can use the curve to control how much foam should be generated at a specific wind speed. The x-axis corresponds to wind speed, which we set in distance wind speed. The further a point is on our x-axis, the stronger wind we need to activate it. The y-axis, on the other hand, controls the amount of foam that should be generated. So let's say that we want the foam to be generated at low wind speed with a full strength and decrease as wind increase. So on our curve we need to raise the y-axis value, meaning foam intensity, right at the start of the x-axis, meaning when the wind is the lowest. Now when we move distant wind speed to the lower values, we will see that the foam appears, but as we start increasing the wind strength, the foam begins to disappear. This is a pretty unrealistic example, but I hope that you now understand how this curve works. At this point, it is also worth mentioning that our foam consists of two layers: surface foam and deep foam. Surface foam is the foam that appears on the surface of the water as a result of waves, and they contains the color that we set in the color section. We can preview it if we go to the mask tab and set debug mode, foam, and choose water foam mode. The second layer is a deep foam, which is generated under the surface of water as bright fragments of it. Now we will return to the Water Decals tab. In this tab we can specify which of the special decals should be taken into account in our water system. Water decals are not classic decals as we know them, but rather a special material applied locally that modifies the standard properties of water in the place where it's located. The first option we can set is region size, which determines how far from the selected point those decals will be visible. We define this point in the region anchor, and it can be any game object or the center of our water system. If we don't specify any point, then by default this region will follow our main camera. Below we can check whether we want to use deformers on our water and what their resolution should be. Next we specify whether we want to use foam, and it is worth remember that these options applies not only to the form from the water decals, but also to regular form. If we want to control our water direction and wave height with water decals, below we have the options to enable additional settings, which we activate in the project settings, graphics, and then click enable in the mask and current water decals. Then, in the simulation tab, water mask and current map will disappear, but we will be able to add them as water decals using the properly prepared material. The advantage of this solution is that we don't need all water area that we want to control on one texture, but we can add appropriate texture to additional decals that we place on the scene. So if we want to use water mask, we check simulation mask. If we want to control our foam with decals as well, we check simulation foam mask. And if we want to control the current map, we check large current. Of course, for each option we can also control the resolution. In a moment we will prepare a simple shader that we can use, but first let's explain the water decals options. To add a water decal to the scene, right-click in the hierarchy window, then select Water, Water Decals. A new object will be created, and if we click on it, several options will appear. The first is Scale mode, where we define how the object scales. If we choose Scale invariant, the object scale using the settings below, where we can increase or decrease its size. If we choose Inherit from hierarchy, then we can also scale the object using the Scale in the Transform window. Next, we have the material field, where we can assign the material that will affect our water. And it is this material that will influence the behavior of our water where the decals is located. With resolution, we can determine the resolution of our decals, and below we can choose how often the decals refresh its influence on the water. Another option is amplitude, which defines the deformation of our water. Thanks to this, we can rise or lower the water level within the bounds of our decals. Next, we have sliders, surface foam dimmer and deep foam dimmer that allow us to control the amount of surface and deep foam in our decals. It is worth mentioning that the standard water decals material by default allows controlling only those three parameters: amplitude, surface foam and deep foam. But we also want to have simulation mask and large current map in the material to control our water in this area. That is why first let's click on the shader used in our material, then using the shortcut Ctrl+C copy it and paste it with Ctrl+V into any folder. Now let's rename it and double click on it. The shader graph will open, and first let's go to the graph inspector and the graph settings tab. Here we can choose which element we want in our shader, so let's check simulation mask and large current. As we will notice, new options will appear in the fragment section. Since we want to use texture to control the water, let's add them to the shader. To do this, right click in the middle and choose Create Node. Then select Sample Texture 2D. Use the shortcut Ctrl+D to duplicate this node because we will use two different textures. Next, let's click the plus icon and select Texture 2D. Let's name the first one Water Mask, duplicate it by Ctrl+D, and the second Current Map. Then drag them to the middle and connect. Water Mask to the first sample texture and the Current Map to the second. As we remember, in the water mask texture, the red channel corresponds to the big waves, so let's connect it to the simulation foam mask so that it generates the foam for us. From this same texture, we also want to extract the RGB channel, which corresponds to the waves. To do that, let's add a new node, Swizzle, and it used to get component from vectors, in our case color channels, and then allows mixing, duplicating or rearranging them. Now we need to specify which channel we want to include. The red channel is vector X, green is Y, blue is Z, and alpha is W. That's why in the mask field we will write X, Y, Z, because the simulation mask requires exactly those three vectors. Next, move to the second texture, and here, just like before, add a swizzle node and connect RGB to in and out to large current. This time we only need red and green channel, so in the mask field write XY. Now let's add our options so we can control how strongly green and red channel influence our water. First, click the plus icon and add float, then rename it to influence, select it, and in the graph inspector in the node settings, set mode to slider. This way, in the material, we will have a slider instead of just a value field. Next, add a new multiply node and connect it to the blue channel. This channel contains information about how strongly the red and green channel influence the water direction in a given spot. Then drag our float and connect it to the multiply. The last thing left is connect multiply to the large current influence, and now we can click the floppy disk icon to save our shader. Let's go back to our scene and create a new material that will use our shader. To do this, right-click in the project window, then select Create Material, and in the shader field choose Shader Graph and your shader. Now let's drag our material into material slot in the water decals. And when we expand this material, we can now easily add texture to it and control the influence of the current map on our water. Of course, we can create many such materials depending on how many water decals we want to use. The last thing we will cover is the water excluder, a component that removes the fragment of the water from the rendering image. It works like a mask, cutting out part of the water surface in the area where the excluder mesh is located. To add an excluder to the scene, right-click in the hierarchy window, Water, Excluder. Now, when we click on this object, in the inspector window we can assign a mesh. Everywhere the mesh covers the water surface, the water won't be visible. Unfortunately, at the time of making this tutorial, this tool isn't very advanced, because it doesn't actually cut out the water, but only doesn't display it in the excluder area. So, for example, if the camera ends up below the water surface, we're using the underwater effect, that effect will be still visible. This might change in the future, but right now, if we are making something like an underwater base where we go from above water to inside, we have to use various tricks like overlapping water surface and script that disable the underwater effect. However, in the situation when the camera can't go below water, Excluder can be useful. Now, let's deal with deformers. In other words, special materials that allow us to manipulating the shape and height of the water within our decals. At the beginning, remember to have the deformation options checked in the water decals on our water, as well as properly assign the region and its size. Of course, we can leave this field empty, then, as I mentioned before, this region will follow our camera. Now, let's add water decals to our scene. Right-click in the hierarchy window, Water, Water Decals. Let's change the update mode to real-time to have a live preview of our decals on the water, and then let's set position and scale. Now, click on the New in the material window and select Deformer and Foam Water Decal. A new material will be created. Of course, the shader used in the material is created in shader graph, so we can freely edit it, but now let's move on to the material options. First, we choose the type of our deformer. Keep in mind that for each type of deformer, we have special options that we can control. The other options, although available, will have no effect on this particular type of deformer. In the HDRP water system, there are 5 types of deformations available for the water surface. Each of them is used for different purpose and has different properties. The first type of deformer is sphere, and it's a type of water deformer that creates spherical deformation of the surface, meaning it pushes or lowers the water within a spherical radius. This is the simplest form of the deformer, and the only things we can control here are its amplitude and size. Next, we have box deformer, which creates a square-shaped deformation. Here, except amplitude and size, we can control how far from the decal's edges the deformation should reach its full height. In simpler terms, this allows us to control the slope of the sides of the square in relation to the water surface. Below that, there is a cube blend options, which let us decide whether the slope should be more linear or more rounded. The next type we can choose is bow wave, which is a special type of deformer for the bow of a boat or ship. Besides height and size, here we can also control the elevation to rise or lower the water level in front of the bow wave, which allow us to simulating the effect of pushing or lowering the water by a boat bow. Then we have shore waves, which is the type of deformer that simulates shore waves. First, we have the wavelength, which we can specify how long the wave should be between its crest and tail. Using skipped waves, we can specify how many waves should be skipped and not generate in our water, which helps prevent waves from being too close to each other and creating an unnatural effect. The next option is wave speed, where we can set the speed of our waves. Remember that the speed of those waves also depends on the time multiplier in the general section of our water, since the time multiplier defines the speed of the entire water simulation, including the simulation of our deformers. Using wave blend, we can specify the range in which the crest of our wave reach its maximum. Simply put, here we define how much the sides of the wave should be flattened from the left and right before reaching their maximum. If we imagine that the entire length of our decal is 100%, then setting x to 0.5 means that the left slope of the wave front will reach its maximum height in the middle of the wave only at breaking point, where the rest of the wave will reach this height much faster. Next, we have offset, where we control the offset of our waves. This is useful when we have many decals generating waves, because if we don't change this, all waves on each decals will be generated at the same time, but using offset we can delay the wave on a given decal. The next option is breaking range, where we set the breaking point and the point where our waves will lose 70% of their height. The breaking point is also the point where our waves reach their maximum height and the foam on the wave surface will start generate. This is also the point where the upper point of the slope that we set in wave blends will reach their maximum height. So, in the x-axis, we can set the location where the wave breaking should start. And again, if we imagine the width of our decals as 100%, setting x to 0.2 means that the breaking point happens after the wave passes 20% of the decal's weight. And on the y-axis, we set the point where the waves will be too small to generate foam, and between this point and the breaking point, the waves gradually decrease its height until they reach only 30% of the original height. So if we set here for example 0.7 and the breaking point is set to 0.2, then when the wave passes 20% of the way, it will start breaking and gradually decrease its height until it passes 70% of the wave. It's a bit complicated, but I hope that you understand how this works. Then we have deep foam, where we control in which range of our decals the deep foam should appear. And just like before, the x value defines the point where these foams start to be generated, and the y value determines point where its generation should end. The last type of deformer is texture, where in the deformation texture window we can place a specially prepared texture. Thanks to it, we can give any shape to our deformer. Such a texture can be created in any graphic program, and then after adding it to Unity, we must only change its wrap mode to clamp, and now we can assign this texture without any problem. Using remap minimum and maximum, we can freely manipulate height and base of the deformer. Below we have foam texture. Thanks to it, we can specify in our deformer where the foam should appear. The black color completely suppresses the foam effect in a given area, where the lighter color, the more foam will be generated in that place. And that's it. I hope this video helped you understand how the HDRP water system works and how to use them. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful, give it a like and subscribe the channel so you don't miss the future tutorials where I will show you practical use of the knowledge gained here. Thanks for watching, good luck with your project, and until next time, see ya!